The Memphis Grizzlies are back in the second seed in the Western Conference, and I'm going to tell you why. There's a real chance for that lead to even grow more over the next couple weeks. Coming up on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, DeMichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal, covering the Memphis Grizzlies. I've been covering the Memphis Grizzlies now since the end of December, towards around Christmas, and it's been a fun ride, highlighting this team, chronicling the journey. When I took this job, they were seated near the bottom of the Western Conference in the 8-9 range, and now they are the number 2 seed after a Golden State loss recently. So things are trending up with the Grizzlies, and I'm your beat writer here just to keep you covered with everything that's going on. But thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listening every day. Remember that Locked On Grizzlies is free and available on YouTube and everywhere else you get your podcast, whether that's Odyssey, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, you can find Locked On Grizzlies. Today, I'm running solo again. I ran solo on Monday, and our co-host Sean Coleman, who a lot of the viewers may be familiar with, he's out on vacation. Sean Coleman has done a really, really good job covering the Grizzlies through the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. He's a great guy, and he's also a Braves fan like myself. So you may hear that from time to time come up on the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. But we're here to talk about the Memphis Grizzlies right now. That's the team we're here to talk about, the number 2 seed in the Western Conference, one of the top teams in the NBA this season. So we hit it off saying that the Grizzlies have a great chance, a prime chance, so to speak, to increase their lead over the Golden State Warriors for the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. First, before we just dive into that number 2 seed talk, let's talk about why the number 2 seed is so important. Because right now, the Timberwolves are firmly entrenched into the 7th seed. And yes, being the 7th seed with the play-in, they'll probably have to play the Los Angeles Clippers, who are the number 8 seed right now. And the winner of that game would potentially face the number 2 seed. So we can even go with the Timberwolves or the Clippers. The Clippers will get Paul George back, which will make them a little bit more formidable, and they're a tough defensive team. The pickup of Robert Covington has really paid off to what they're doing. But you have the Clippers and the Timberwolves, and then there's the 6 and the 5 right now, which are the Dallas Mavericks and the Denver Nuggets. The Denver Nuggets are the 6th seed. The Denver Nuggets are expected, by all accounts, many people who I've talked to are expecting the Denver Nuggets to try to get Michael Porter Jr. and Jamal Murray back for the playoffs. So if you do some refreshing in your mind real quick and think back to what those Denver Nuggets teams in the past, the one that went to the Western Conference Final in the bubble, or the one that was one of the top seeds in the West last season before Jamal Murray tore his ACL. Think back to those teams and potentially running into that type of Denver Nuggets team in the playoffs. Sure, Jamal Murray wouldn't be 100%, but an 85% Jamal Murray is better than probably Campazzo or Monte Morris, as good as he is as one of the top backup point guards. But that starter role, Jamal Murray is the guy. And we remember that Jamal Murray and Nikola Jokic pick and roll being one of the best in the NBA. Plus, you factor in Michael Porter Jr. and his scoring ability, which the Nuggets could really use. That's a team I don't think, as the Grizzlies fans, you should want to play. And then we've talked about, the Mavericks at 3. They've won the last 3 meetings against the Grizzlies. Luka Doncic has been a thorn in the Grizzlies' side for some time. Defensively, they present, some trouble to the Grizzlies with the way that they defend. They're long, they're athletic, and they're very aggressive. Kristaps Porzingis actually played a big role in that. We saw he had, I believe, 6 blocks in that last meeting and really changed some things up. So the Mavs don't have Porzingis anymore, but it doesn't look like they're missing him. Just from all accounts from Mavs fans and people on that angle, the team is better. I mean, we've seen Spencer Dinwiddie have some really good games. So do you want to play the Mavs or the Nuggets, or do you want to play the Clippers or the Timberwolves? Because that's the difference in the 2 seed and that's the difference in the 3 seed, which I think is a very big difference. So let's get into this 2 seed talk a little bit more. The Grizzlies gained control of the number 2 seed when they won on Saturday over the Orlando Magic. And they actually lost the 2 seed on Sunday when the Warriors were off. And, what we call one of the worst losses of the season for the Grizzlies. They lost to a team that was on a 12-game losing streak, the Houston Rockets. That game put them in a tie in the loss column with 22 losses with the Golden State Warriors, but the Warriors had the advantage in terms of percentage. So that gave the Warriors the advantage there. And the Warriors played on Monday, and the Warriors lost. So the Warriors' recent loss now puts the Grizzlies back in the 2nd seed and in firm control. Let's explain why the Grizzlies are in control. Because the Grizzlies' schedule coming up is the Pelicans, trending upward. Really, really good team, I think, trending upward. But you have the Pelicans, you have the New York Knicks, who are at 26-38, and you have the Oklahoma City Thunder, who, we saw the Grizzlies. Granted, some players were missing, but we saw the Grizzlies set an NBA record in terms of point differential when they beat them earlier this season. Granted, and the Thunder did win the most recent meeting, but it was Ja Morant's first game back. But that's neither here nor there. That's still a game that this Grizzlies team should easily win based on their current seeding and the way they've played since Christmas time. So you look at those games, and then you go over to the Warriors schedule. In that same time, the Warriors will be playing the Denver Nuggets, also known as the team who just beat them on Monday, and they will play the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, we should mention that Denver did beat them, and it was a close game, but Stephen Curry, Andrew Wiggins, and Klay Thompson did not go on that trip. So neither of them made that trip. So this will be a fairly different looking, Golden State team. But Golden State still, they're on a losing streak right now, 4 or 5 games in a row. And you factor that in as compared to playing, the Milwaukee Bucks. Combined with the Grizzlies playing the Pelican, Knicks, and the Thunder, there is a chance the Grizzlies could extend this half-game lead up to potentially a game and a half to 2 games when we revisit this early next week. And another factor in this is the impending return of Draymond Green. Draymond Green, who has his own podcast, announced that he is targeting, in his own words, he is targeting March 14th as his return date. So when Draymond gets back, I believe he's one of the more impactful power forwards in the game. And, that team could use his energy, his defense. They've been struggling defensively lately. Some things are going to shift. I think Golden State is going to look much better. We're not going to see the same team that's been on this losing streak. Draymond Green is really going to shift some things around. So once you factor that in, the Grizzlies are in prime position right now. This is their chance to really crack open this league, to gain a little cushion. And even after, those games that I mentioned against the Pelicans, Knicks, and the Thunder, you have the Pacers, who aren't in contention. And then you also have, the Hawks, who are, a decent team, and you're going on the road playing a team that's around 500. That's a tricky game, I believe. But then after that, you get another game against Houston. And if we know anything about this Grizzlies team, they're going to go in that game against Houston not playing, like Houston is, has the worst record in the NBA. They're going to play like Houston is the team who just beat them, and they're going to be motivated. And I would guess that game's going to look a lot different. So once you factor in the upcoming schedule, all the way up to March 20th, I believe that is. Uh, the Grizzlies have a chance not only to create some cushion, but they have some chance to sustain it. And you have a March 28th contest against Golden State, which will be very big from an implications perspective. But you don't want that game, if the Grizzlies lose that game, to be where Golden State retakes the lead. You want that game, let's say if you're up 2 games over Golden State, if they win that game, now you have a 1 game lead and you have to hold them off, the next 4 or 5 games for the remainder of the season. That'll be a better position to be in. So the Grizzlies are in a position. I mean, the ball is in their court. Right now, they have a weaker schedule coming up than the Golden State Warriors. Right now, Draymond Green is out. He is getting close to returning. He's targeting the 14th for his return, but the Warriors have the Nuggets and they have the Bucks in that time. They'll probably lose one of those games. Chances are they'll lose one of those games. The Grizzlies shouldn't lose any of these upcoming games based on the way, you would expect things to turn out on paper. But as we saw, Sunday, things don't always go how they should on paper. So that's why we say the ball's in the Grizzlies' court. This is the chance to make some things happen. But that first game that they're going to have to play will be against the Pelicans, one of the hottest teams in the NBA. So we'll break that game down next. But first, can we discuss Bet Online and the odds that they have for these games, these Tuesday games? 3 games with solid favorites that we're going to witness. The Nets against the Charlotte Hornets. That's a road game for the Nets, which means Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, and of course the Nets will be favored in that game. And then you have the Cavs, Pacers. We just mentioned that the Pacers are in that lower tier right now, whereas the Cavs, they just got bad news and Jared Allen, but still lots of talent. I mean, not too many teams can lose a guy like Jared Allen and say, fine, we're just going to insert former All-Star Kevin Love, who's actually had a really good year, possibly, a 6-man of the year candidate type season into the starting lineup. And then there's the Grizzlies Pelican games. So all these games have clear favorites: Nets, Cavs, Grizzlies. But Bet Online not only has you covered with basketball, you can go over for hockey, boxing, UFC, and much more. So head over to the website, go take some risky bets, go win you some money, and learn more about what betonline.net has going on. So let's get into the Grizzlies versus the Pelicans. This is an interesting game, to say the least. Over the years, the Pelicans have had the Grizzlies' numbers. In recent years, they have been very good. But let's throw all that out the window. We don't even have to discuss those numbers, because this Pelican team looks completely different. This isn't the same Pelicans team. CJ McCollum, Brandon Ingram are your 2 go-to players. And, they've inserted a new start lineup, and they've turned their season around. The Pelicans have won 4 of the last 5 games. That includes wins over the Phoenix Suns, the Los Angeles Lakers, and the Utah Jazz. Not just wins, by the way. We're talking double-digit wins, blowouts over each of these teams. Even in the most recent game that they lost, it took a 46-point triple-double from Nikola Jokic in overtime to snap a 4-game win streak for the Pelicans. So what you may say, what's the biggest part of this win streak? I think it's their defense. They held 3 straight teams under 100 points before the Nuggets in that stretch. Lakers held them under 100. Jazz, which is, considered one of the NBA's top-tier offenses, held them under 100. Held the Sacramento Kings under 100. The Suns, before those 3 games, got over 100, but the Suns only had 102 points. So teams are having trouble scoring against this squad. So a big reason why teams are having trouble scoring against the Pelicans is this new big lineup that they've introduced, and I like big lineups. I like big lineups when you have, the right personnel to make some fancy things happen. And we've seen that with the Cavaliers this season, using, Evan Mobley and Markin and Jared Allen in those supersized lineups. And Evan Mobley, for example, is the one guy who makes that work because of his ability to switch on the guards. And Jared Allen is good at it too, but Evan Mobley is next level with his ability to switch onto guards. But with the Pelicans, they look at Jackson Hayes as that same type of guy. Whereas if he switched on to a point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, they like their chances. They like their chances in that matchup. So the Pelicans have started to go with this bigger, supersized lineup where they start CJ McCollum. They go with Herb Jones, who, is the rookie, but Herb Jones was the SEC Defensive Player of the Year, and that part of his game has translated seamlessly to the NBA. He's been a great young defender, one of the best rookie defenders probably in the NBA right now. Then you have Brandon Ingram entrenched into that 3 role. And then there's the supersized big man lineup of Jackson Hayes and Jonas Valanciunas, 2 really big bigs. So the first thing that you notice in this matchup is immediately the Pelicans take away one of the Grizzlies' big advantages, and that's size. Jaren Jackson Jr. does not see a lot of forwards that are even close to his size on a nightly basis. I mean, we saw that Celtics game when he really got things going. He was being guarded, by smaller guards and forwards, and, he scored 20-plus points in that game. And we've seen just, even in this recent game against the Rockets, he had foul trouble, but he was guarded by undersized players. And that's pretty much the case most of the nights for him. He's usually guarded by smaller guys. This time around, he's probably going to have Jackson Hayes in front of him. Jackson Hayes is just as tall. He's just as big. He's just as lanky. And he can jump out of the building just like, Jaren Jackson and the length that Jaren Jackson has. He can counter it. It's an interesting matchup. It's a very interesting matchup, to say the least, because the Pelicans take away that advantage, which kind of, helps them in another area that the Grizzlies are really good at, and that's the rebound. The Grizzlies are the number 1 rebounding team in the league. So these teams recently did play. But, the Grizzlies won that game, 121-109, February the 15th, right before the All-Star break. But that's another game where I feel like throw it out of the window. Throw it out of the window. It doesn't matter in this game simply because this was before the Pelicans changed their lineup. So at this time, they still had guys like Devontae Graham starting, and he's a big piece of that bench now. He and Jose Alvarado, who's going to pick up guys full court. Watching him pick up Tyus Jones full court is going to be really fun because that's going to be a fun matchup. But then, you talk about just them changing the starting lineup. You move more of those pieces to the bench, add it so you get more bench scoring. You put the ball in CJ McCollum's hands a little bit more. So that's a different starting lineup. But the last thing we want to see in this game, I think, from the Grizzlies is the mental side of things. How will the Grizzlies respond to what was an embarrassing loss? So embarrassing that, we talked to Taylor Jenkins after the game, and it was 2 minutes. Taylor Jenkins clearly wasn't happy. And, we talked to, some players. Ja Morant said, you just flush it. Forget about it. That Rockets loss, that is. Just forget about that game, and you move on. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've been covering the Grizzlies since around Christmas time. So I joked around with a lot of people that I hadn't seen the Grizzlies lose 2 games in a row since I got on the beat. And my first time seeing the Grizzlies lose 2 games in a row was when they lost their last game before the All-Star break and their first game after the All-Star break. Outside of that, every time the Grizzlies have lost, whether it was recently against the Celtics and any other loss they've had, pretty much just throughout this stretch, they've always responded pretty strongly. So how will they respond against this Pelicans team who is pretty much blown out teams lately. And the one game they didn't win, it was an overtime win by the Nuggets, and it took a Superman effort from Nikola Jokic. So this isn't going to be an easy game. One reason this isn't going to be an easy game is because the Pelicans have one of the NBA's biggest Grizzlies killers in CJ McCollum. So we're going to talk about CJ McCollum and his history of dominating the Grizzlies coming up. CJ McCollum, he's one of those guys where you say he's a Memphis Grizzlies killer. He's a Memphis Grizzlies killer. 6 30-point games against the Grizzlies. He averaged over 22 points per game against the Grizzlies in his career. His only game with the Pelicans, we mentioned that 121-109 win for the Grizzlies. In that game, CJ McCollum had 30 points. 12 of 25 of shooting. He was 0 of 5 from three-point range. So in that game, he didn't even make a three and still had 30 points. We're talking about a guy who, makes over 2.5 threes per game. So him making, under 3 threes is rare, let alone him making 0 threes in a game. So CJ McCollum, he's a Grizzlies killer. And we talked about, the Grizzlies, how they've guarded guards. And it's something I've really paid close attention to since joining this beat. I think of, some shifty guards have given the Grizzlies problems. We mentioned on yesterday's show, we talked about D'Angelo Russell, talked about DeMar DeRozan and those type guys. We didn't mention Tyrese Maxey, who toward the end of January had one of the best games of his career against the Grizzlies, and they couldn't stay in front of him. And then we mentioned, Jalen Green, Kevin Porter Jr. the other day. All guards the Grizzlies had trouble staying in front of. And, CJ McCollum he's probably just as shifty, just as smooth as any of them. CJ McCollum is a certified bucket. He is one of those dudes. So you look at what he's done in his career, not only against the Grizzlies, but just as a hooper. And then you compare this season with Portland to this season with the Pelicans. He's brought it up to a whole nother notch since the trade. We're talking going from 20 points per game to 26 points per game. We're talking going from 43% shooting to 51% shooting. Even his three-point shooting, which wasn't even bad in Portland. I believe he was at over 38%. But he's at 40% now. So clearly, what I think we're seeing from CJ McCollum is with the Pelicans, he has the ball in his hands a little bit more, which, we wondered because with the Trailblazers, if you ever wanted to be picky, CJ McCollum was more of a combo guard who could flourish with the ball in his hands, and he did have a lot of those situations. But at the end of the day, you're not taking the ball out of Damian Lillard's hands, that much. So that was tricky in that way. But here we're seeing what CJ McCollum can do when you put him in pick and roll and say, go work, because he's been really good in that role, and his numbers show it. He's shooting better. He's taking more shots. He's more efficient, and he's tough. He's really tough. So you say, who guards him? Dillon Brooks isn't back yet. Dillon Brooks is out for this game. So who guards CJ McCollum? Do you go with Desmond Bane, who, from a strength perspective, he's strong enough to, when CJ McCollum calls on a lot of those screens and he gets to those mid-range spots and he bodies you up before he goes to his fadeaways and his turnarounds and all of that. Desmond Bane is strong enough to handle that, but he doesn't have the length. So do you go to Zaire Williams, who has the length to contest some of those shots, maybe make him alter some of those shots a little bit? I think you start the game with Zaire Williams on him, see how that goes. But overall, I think, in the closing minutes, I'm expecting DeAnthony Melton to be in this game. Now, we did talk about Taylor Jenkins, how he coaches. He's a field coach. So, in order for DeAnthony Melton to be in the game, DeAnthony Melton will have to have played a really good game or a decent game. He will have to have had shown that, he had a solid defensive showing for Taylor Jenkins to turn to him. But I think DeAnthony Melton is the best chance the Grizzlies have at slowing down CJ McCollum. And maybe that's letting CJ McCollum, go for 22, 24 points through the better part of 3 quarters where DeAnthony Melton's not spending a lot of time guarding them because they're not in the game a lot at the same time. But in the fourth quarter, when the game's on the line, you go to your best guy who, Melton's been that. Melton's one of the top NBA players in deflections right now, and he's coming off the bench. He is so disruptive. I watch him and Kyle Anderson and what they do with their hands and legit Melton, he does it more, with his length. I think Kyle Anderson does it more with quickness, but those two guys have some of the best hands in the league, and that bench is led by the havoc that they wreak from a defensive perspective. So you go with DeAnthony Melton as your guy down the stretch against CJ McCollum. And then maybe you throw a Kyle Anderson at him a little bit, depending on the flow of the game. We saw Kyle Anderson, was the guy who not only got the DeMar DeRozan matchup at the end of that Bulls game, but he told the guys in the huddle, I got DeRozan. And we saw the result was, him stripping the ball out of DeRozan's hands, forcing a turnover, and DeRozan getting ejected, and the Grizzlies winning that game. So you have options. I do believe that the starters, Desmond Bane, Zaire Williams, aren't the best options. So once you factor that in, I think your best option is DeAnthony Melton. We'll see how his game goes. We'll see how he plays on the offensive end, how he plays leading up into that fourth quarter. And he's your guy to close that game because CJ McCollum, he's probably going to get his. We didn't even mention Brandon Ingram, who just came off of a 38-point performance in that game against the Nuggets. He's a basket too. You probably have to put Zaire Williams on Brandon Ingram from a size perspective. So now you have to put Desmond Bane on to CJ McCollum, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. The Grizzlies have options, like you said, DeAnthony Melton off the bench. John Conchar is another one off the bench who can make an impact defensively. Taylor Jenkins has depended on him at times as well. So there are options there, or you may just have to scheme CJ McCollum out of the game. Maybe trap him, throw some blitzes at him. Just throw different defensive coverages, which is something Taylor Jenkins does like to do, to take him out of his rhythm. But I believe he is the bigger threat, even more so than Brandon Ingram in this game against the Grizzlies. But as always, we thank you, the listeners, for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. Tomorrow, we're going to recap the Grizzlies and the Pelicans. We're going to see how the Grizzlies performed against the Pelicans, and we're going to dive more into the return of Dillon Brooks. So we'll get an update on Taylor Jenkins, from Taylor Jenkins tomorrow on Dillon Brooks' status, and we will provide those updates here on Locked On Grizzlies. Now, before you leave, make your second listen Lock On NBA. So Lock On NBA is where the Lock On experts are covering the biggest stories around the NBA in just 30 minutes every Monday through Friday. So we're talking, a quick walk of your dog or jog outside or your commute to work. And you can listen to Locked On NBA, and it's free and available wherever you get your podcast, just like Locked On Grizzlies. So be sure to subscribe. Be sure to download the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Once again, listeners, we thank you again for listening to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, DeMichael Cole, and we appreciate you, and we will see you tomorrow.